So welcome everyone to today's NLISN session. We're joined by two PhD candidates from different universities in Sweden, Katarina and Karin, who are both going to be talking to us about different neurodivergent reading practices within Swedish educational contexts. So I'm going to hand you over to Katarina and Karin, who will do a fuller introduction of themselves. And I think Katarina is going to be sharing slides first, so you can get those set up. We've tested that, so we know it's working okay. So I'll hand over to them for today's session. If you have any questions at all during the presentation, feel free to use the chat to add them in, and then we'll also have time at the end to go through those, and you can also ask questions verbally at the end as well.
Thank you, Mariah. And I will share our presentation. We will start with a presentation together first. Can you see just the presentation and not the notes?
Yes.
Yes, good. So thank you for having us. And we are here to talk about our research, our doctoral projects on neurodivergent reading practices in a Swedish educational context. And we will start with a presentation of us, who we are. And my name is Katarina Hagberg. I have a Master of Education, and I worked as a teacher for a bit over 10 years, teaching art and drama. I also hold a Master in Library and Information Science, and I worked as a lecturer at the Swedish School of Library and Information Science at the University of Borås. And I'm now a doctoral student at the Swedish School of Library and Information Science at the University of Borås. And as a doctoral student, I'm also part of the research school Resource, Transforming Reading and Source Criticism in Digital Cultures. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and my name is Karin Lund. I have a previous background where I studied a bachelor in English after doing my master's in archives, libraries, and museums. And before starting my PhD studies, I worked as a librarian, most recently at Malmö University Library, where I worked with supporting students with print disabilities. But now I'm a doctoral student at the Department of Arts and Cultural Sciences at Lund University in the south of Sweden. And like Katarina, I'm also part of the research school. That was hard to say.
Yes, and we would like to say something about the language we use, because in a Swedish context, it's more common to use person first and not identity first. And you can see that in our the titles on our projects, and that's why we use person first in this presentation. Do you want to say something about that, Karin, or?
No, I guess I would also like to say about my research that I'm studying how students with ADHD use audiobooks and text-to-speech technologies in their studies. But I think it's important to note that these audio technologies are not a panacea that works for everyone who has ADHD. Yeah, I just want to make that clear that it's not a solution for everyone, but that's what I'm studying in my my research.
Yeah, I will continue with the next slide. I think. No. So, yes. I will just begin with a brief description of the Swedish school system and the Swedish School Act, focusing on rights and obligations. And when I say rights, I mean the rights each pupil has to guidance and support regarding their education. And in Sweden, the first 10 years of school are compulsory, and the children begin in August, the year that they turn 6. And after this, secondary school is voluntary, but almost all teenagers attend secondary school, and both primary and secondary schools are free. And according to the Swedish School Act, all children and pupils in all types of school and after-school recreation centers shall be given the guidance and stimulation they need for their learning and personal development, so that based on their own abilities and individual conditions, they can develop as far as possible in accordance with the objectives of the education. And it is further stated in the School Act that pupils who, as a result of a disability, have difficulty meeting the various grading criteria or criteria assessing knowledge that apply, shall be given the support aimed at counteracting the consequences of the disability as far as possible. So in other words, every pupil has the right to learn and grow no matter their abilities. And one tool that a large proportion of the Swedish pupils have access to is ILT education. And a majority of the country's 219 municipalities, I think about 287, have subscribed to services such as audiobooks through ILT education. And that is a commercial company that primarily offers school textbooks and easy-to-read fiction for pupils in primary and secondary schools. ILT education enables pupils to read by listening, but there are some critical voices regarding giving a commercial company such a large role in education and schools in Sweden. So that's just short about the Swedish school system.
So when it comes to higher education, if you have some kind of impairment which may create difficulties for you to read printed text, for instance, visual impairment, dyslexia, ADHD. It could be that you've done an eye surgery, or that you can't physically hold a book. You have the right of getting your course literature in accessible formats. And these course books are produced by a government agency called the Swedish Agency for Accessible Media, or Myndigheten för tillgängliga medier in Swedish, which is abbreviated MTM. So they're tasked with producing accessible reading materials such as braille books and audiobooks as an exception to the Swedish Copyright Act. And the current model, as a student, if you have the need to access your course literature in the form of audiobooks, you can contact your local university library to get access to MTM's digital audiobook library, which is called Legimus. And after you've accessed that, gotten a login, you can go in there, search your books, and download your course literature through there, as long as it is in the form of a full-length book, because MTM does not adapt shorter articles into audiobooks. So it's only for, I think it has to be 50 pages or more. The current model, where you don't actually need to show any medical certificate that you have a certain diagnosis, you just need to meet a librarian and tell them about your difficulties with reading print. That model has been subject to a lot of criticism lately from publishers of course literature, who claim that there is a widespread misuse of Legimus material, and that there is a lot of plagiarism going on. There has been an independent investigation of this, which could find no widespread plagiarism of Legimus materials. But since we currently have a right-wing government who loves commercial enterprises, the current model is likely subject to change. So in future, Agency for Accessible Media has suggested that instead of doing it through the libraries, students will have to access Legimus through the disability support at the universities, where you often need some kind of certificate that you have a certain diagnosis to be able to get disability support. So that's the current situation.
Yes. And now some previous research. And the ability to read and interpret different types of text can be significantly impacted by neuropsychiatric disabilities. And this, of course, affects cognitive abilities. And in early 2023, me and Karin, wrote a literature review examining user studies in library and information science on reading practices with among people with neuropsychiatric disabilities. And we wrote this review together with our supervisor, Anna Lund, and my co-supervisor, Åsa Hedemark. And as we are working in a Swedish context, we based our study on a Swedish definition of neuropsychiatric disabilities, and this includes ADHD, ADD, dyslexia, autism, Tourette syndrome, and developmental language disorders. We included 14 peer-reviewed articles in this literature review, and most of the articles address dyslexia. And a majority of the studies have been conducted in educational settings and have experimental research design. And it means that the studies were conducted through predetermined tasks, and 6 of the reviewed studies address assistive technologies for reading, and the remaining 8 concern reading in relation to information practices. And in this review, we can conclude that there's an imbalance in the types of impairments that have been addressed in previous research in library and information science. And it is also evident that just a few studies concern everyday reading practices. And there's also a lack of research that delves deeper into the experiences of readers with neuropsychiatric disabilities. Karin, you are muted.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. So we both place our studies within a larger research field, which is called critical studies of reading. And critical studies of reading, compared to, reading is studied within a lot of different research fields, of course. But what often happens is that, as Katarina was telling you now in the previous research, it's often done in a very evaluative, experimental way. Whereas critical studies of reading is not that interested in defining what reading is and what reading isn't, but instead it wishes to study how reading manifests itself in different contexts and to analyze the discursive practices that shape reading with the aim of scrutinizing the assumptions underlying the rhetoric and practice of reading. So it tries to take a non-evaluative approach to reading and study how people actually read and not how they should be reading. And it takes an interest in social and material aspects of reading. And it sees reading as a practice that can be performed in different ways, with different senses and using different tools.
Yes. And now I will talk about my doctoral project. And I have the working title, Reading to Learn, Exploring Reading Practices Among Adolescents with Dyslexia. And in this project, I explore how adolescents with dyslexia describe their school-related reading. And I focus on the tools and strategies they use and have access to, as well as the tools and strategies they don't use or don't have access to. And alongside these lived experiences, I'm also interested in the current debate on children and young people's reading in Sweden today. It's a debate where politicians talk about a reading crisis and a shift from screens to print. And I will give some background to this project and the focus in the project. And the ability to read is a central skill in today's society, encompassing education, professional life, and everyday activities. And in addition to reading ability, advanced literacy is also required for active participation in the society. And advanced literacy includes, among others, the ability to analyze, interpret, and critically evaluate different kinds of text. And as our society changes and technology advances, so do the demands for advanced literacy. And it's both for children and adults, of course. And reading is often described as essential for active participation. And in this sense, it can be described in terms of responsibility. But the ability to read is also a right to access text and information in various ways. And previous research on dyslexia, as we said before, often focuses on an educational focus and the intention to develop digital tools or assistive technology. And research on children and disability has often focused on the adults' perspectives, such as those of parents, teachers, librarians, rather than the child's perspective. And although this study focuses on school-related reading, it does so from a user perspective rather than an educational perspective. My aim is not to identify the right strategies or tools, but to identify norms about reading, capture descriptions, and lived experiences of reading practices in an environment and activity that are a large part of young people's everyday lives, school and school-related reading, that is. And we read in different ways, in different formats, and for different purposes. And as I mentioned before, the focus of this project is the school-related reading. And this reading includes, among other things, formats that are printed and in audio or digital. It includes fiction and non-fiction, as well as instructions and different types of homeworks. So school-related reading is the reading performed both in and out of school, but in relation to the adolescents' schoolwork. And in this project, I center the adolescents' own descriptions, perspectives, and experiences, and I adopt a norm-critical and rights-based lens regarding reading and accessibility. And the project aims to increase the knowledge, strengthen the understanding, and highlight the needs, conditions, and reading practices of adolescents with dyslexia. And the following 3 research questions guide the study. The first one is, how do adolescents with dyslexia describe their school-related reading? The second one, what tools and strategies do adolescents with dyslexia use for the school-related reading, and how do these tools and strategies affect their reading practices? And the third question is, how is reading conceptualized in the Swedish societal debate on children and young people's reading, and how might these conceptualizations influence the reading practices of adolescents with dyslexia? And to answer these questions, methods, and by combining these methods, I can grasp various aspects and perspective of the participants' reading activities and reading practices. And the methods I use for this project include semi-structured interviews, photo elicitation, and discourse analysis. And through these methods, I hope to convey descriptions and actual practices and norms that shape the participants' reading practices. I conducted the semi-structured interviews and the photo elicitation to answer the first 2 questions of the study, and I did so between January and September this year. I undertook semi-structured interviews with each participant, And at the end of the interview, I asked them to take photographs over the next couple of weeks, representing the reading, the places where they read, and the tools and formats they use for their reading. And then we met again for a second interview, and this time the interview was guided by the photographs that they had taken. And I met each participant twice, and each interview lasted for 30 to 60 minutes. And during the interviews, we talked about the reading, whether and how they talk about the reading with friends, family, and teachers. We talked about how they read, what format they use, and so on. And we also talked about what they think about reading, amongst other things, of course. And to answer the third question, I will conduct a discourse analysis of the societal debate on children and young people's reading in Sweden today. And I will talk a bit more about that on another slide. But now I will talk about my participants in the study. And this is a qualitative research project which focuses on a few in-depth descriptions of reading practices. And I have therefore met with 11 participants aged 13 to 15, and they are in the last 3 years of Swedish primary school, and that is year 7 to 9. And several of my participants are under 15, so I have to obtain informed consent from both the participants themselves and the guardians. And I have mainly recruited participants through various dyslexia-focused associations, but also digital learning platforms used by Swedish primary schools. And the dyslexia associations have mainly sent information through their social media channels and their mailing lists. But I have also participated in a Swedish podcast about dyslexia, led by adolescents with dyslexia, and it's called Disserpodden in Swedish. So that's the different ways I've taken to recruit my participants. And this study is planned to result in a compilation thesis, which means that I am going to write a summary text and 4 articles. And the first article is the research review, literature review we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and that one is already published. And the remaining 3 articles are planned to be based on the material I collect and will collect through interviews, photo elicitation, and discourse analysis. And I will talk a bit more about my second and third articles. They're the ones that I'm working on right now. The fourth one is planned to address the material from interviews and photo elicitation, but I haven't decided on the focus yet. So I will leave that one out in this presentation. So currently I'm working on 2 articles, and one of them will focus on the debate on the Swedish reading crisis, and it will be a discourse analysis, and I will examine the societal debate surrounding children and young people's reading in Sweden today. And when the results of PEARLS, the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, were presented in May 2023, the Minister of Education in Sweden expressed that Sweden has a reading crisis, as 5% of the Swedish children who participated in this study did not reach the lowest level of reading comprehension. And the pupils participating in the survey are in year 4, so they are 10 years old. And that is a year when reading shifts from learning to read to reading to learn. And the discourse of a reading crisis exploded when the results of PEARLS were presented. And in connection with this, an initiative was presented for Swedish schools to reduce the use of digital tools in favor of printed books, which the Minister of Education then called real books. And since this initiative was presented, children and young people's reading has continued to be debated in Swedish media, both by politicians and by teachers and other actors with an interest in reading and education. And part of this debate concerns how we read through printed books, audiobooks, and so on, and whether reading by listening can actually be considered reading. And several politicians and professionals in Swedish schools argue that reading by listening is not reading, and reading by listening is deepening the reading crisis. Both in the debate and in material from my interviews, there is a mistrust among adults, like politicians and school professionals, that reading by listening is the same as taking the easy way out. And reading with the eyes is considered both more demanding and more rewarding than reading with the ears. So that's the discourse analysis I'm working on. And my third article will focus on the school norms for reading and the participants' reading practices. And as I said, I will address the results from my interviews and the photo elicitation. And some emergent themes in the material are that the participants are expected to read, but teachers and other school professionals rarely talk to them about the reading or their experiences. And it's also evident that reading was more of a shared activity when the participants were younger. And this applies both at school and at home. And as the participants get older, they are left alone with the reading more often. However, it is the adults' opinions that to a great extent determine what constitutes reading and what material is considered appropriate. And this also applies both at school and at home to teachers as well as parents. And the material also shows that accessible reading is not given. It requires personal responsibility and engagement from participants and their parents. And despite the strong adult influence, the participants, who are minors entitled to support under the Swedish School Act, are held primarily responsible for their reading. And lastly, reading is more than just reading long printed texts. Still, it's these activities that are primarily considered reading, and many other school tasks are also difficult for adolescents with dyslexia, such as problem solving in mathematics. And this indicates a need for a broader understanding of reading. And now I will stop sharing and hand over to you, Karin.
Thank you. I'll share my screen here. Sorry, I'm not that used to. There we go. So the current working title of my dissertation is Reading by Listening in Academia, Students with ADHD's Use of Audio-Based Technologies for Reading in Higher Education. And I'm doing a monograph, so it will be published as an open access book somewhere in 2027 is the plan. I'm writing it in Swedish, but there will be, if you're interested in reading it once it's done, there will be a summary in English at the end, and I'm also thinking of reworking some of my results into English language articles at a later point. So the background to my topic is my background as a librarian working with students who had print disabilities at university. So the number of students in Swedish higher education who express the need for audiobooks is steadily increasing. And while dyslexia or dyslexic students is still the largest group, the largest increase have been among students with so-called neuropsychiatric impairments. And as Katarina was telling you about, we found in our literature review that most previous research concerned visual impairments and dyslexia, while the previous research on reading by listener reading or readers with ADHD is virtually non-existent. I think we found only one study that concerned readers with ADHD, and those were pretty young children. So there is a very big scarcity of research on this topic, and there's also a need for more qualitative research on how students use audio-based technologies for reading in their everyday lives. So my project aims to create knowledge about how students with ADHD use audio-based technologies for reading in higher education. And I conceptualize this as academic reading by listening. And my aim is also to investigate how norms about academic reading influence students' reading practices. So some of my research questions are, how do students with ADHD use audio-based reading technologies in their studies? How do students reflect on their own reading by listening and the role of audio-based technologies for reading in their studies? And what norms regarding academic reading do students meet? And how do these norms influence their reading practices? I've been using qualitative methods for this project. First, I conduct semi-structured focus groups with 3 to 5 participants. And these are quite loose in their forms. We meet, we have coffee and something sweet, and we talk about their course literature, how they read, what they think about audiobooks and text-to-speech. And I do have like a battery of questions with me, but I'm not following the interview guides very strictly. Instead, I encourage participants to bring up their own topic and ask each other questions. After that, I've conducted individual follow-up interviews with a selection of participants. And there we have gone more into depth, talking about their individual reading practices. And also they've shown me how they use these technologies, where they, what they do when they read their course literature, basically. So far I've interviewed a total of 26 students. I'm wrapping up my data collection, so I might be doing a couple more individual interviews, but I'm done with the focus groups interviews. I've met with 20 bachelor level students and 6 master's level students. 20 of my participants have been Swedish students and 6 international students. Some of my participants, or actually most of them, have been formally diagnosed with ADHD, but I also have some participants who self-identify as having ADHD, and some participants also mention other diagnoses such as autism and dyslexia. And the participants represent a variety of academic fields such as arts and humanities, social sciences, and STEM. So what I argue, like Katarina, is that reading by listening is it's not the easy way out. It's something that you actually have to develop, that you have to practice, same as you need to practice reading printed books with your eyes. As I was saying, I'm sorry, I think one of my slides has gone missing. I just need to, there we go. Yeah, as Katarina was saying, in the debate on reading by listening, it's often constructed as a threat to reading by seeing, that either you read by seeing, and that is the correct, proper way to read, or you read by listening, or you don't read by listening, you just listen to audiobooks, and that is not the same. But in my research, there's kind of a blurred line between reading by listening and reading by seeing, because most of these audiobooks that are produced by MTM also contain the written text. So most of my participants, they read the text with their eyes while they're listening to the audiobooks. So reading by listening does not really replace reading by seeing, but rather it complements it and it supports it. And participants chose different ways to read depending on the task. So for instance, when they were starting a course, they often listened to the audiobook or read the audiobook to get an overview of the topic. While later in the course, for instance, when they were writing an individual assignment, then they turned to either the printed text or the text in the audiobook to be able to quote, for instance, since when you're reading by listening, you don't get spellings, you don't get punctuations. So they were using it in different ways depending on the task. And I found that reading by listening supported the participants' focus and motivation. It helped them get started with their reading. For instance, one participant reported that on her commute to uni, she would read the audiobook, and when she got to uni, she would turn off the audiobook and instead read the physical book. And it also helped them to maintain focus when reading longer texts, since the audiobook has this function of you can see it follows along in the text and it highlights the sentence that is being read aloud at the moment. One participant said that she used reading by listening as body doubling. It gave her the impression of having another person studying with her, especially when she was reading audiobooks that had human narrators. And several participants also mentioned analog reading by listening. So they were not listening to a digital audiobook, but they were reading aloud to themselves, or they were reading aloud to another person to be able to both listen and see at the same time. Most of my participants had started using audio-based technologies for reading when they started higher education, since most of them, even though you're not formally required to have a diagnosis of ADHD, for instance, to get access to these technologies, when they got the diagnosis, that was often when they were made aware that this support is available to them. So most of them have started using it in higher education, but some had used them in previous schooling. And their proficiency in using these technologies varied a lot, and those who had used it in previous schooling generally knew a lot more than the ones who had started using it in higher education. And some participants had received some support from the library or from teachers in learning how to use these technologies, but most of them had learned on their own. There were a few technical barriers to reading by listening. Few course books are produced with human narration. So if it's a fiction book, then MTM uses a human narrator. But when it comes to course books, most of the time they're produced with speech synthesis. And Swedish being a relatively small language, Swedish speech synthesis is not at the same level as English yet. So many participants complained about poor text-to-speech narration. For one thing, the voices were often very robotic, monotonous, devoid of emotion, which is not helpful when you're reading a textbook that you might not find that engaging to begin with. And they also had a lot of problems with incorrect pronunciation. For instance, there was a participant who was taking sociology, and in Swedish, the word for sex is kön, and the word for Q is kön. These two words are spelled the same, but they have very different meaning. But every time the audiobook we're supposed to read sex, it instead read the Q, which of course was extremely annoying, and it hindered her comprehension and her focus. And many of the books have both text and audio, but some of them only have audio. And that was very problematic to many participants because they needed to be able to follow along in the text to maintain focus. So they did not enjoy books that had only audio only at all. There were also some structural barriers to reading by listening. Some participants reported downright discriminatory actions by their teachers, such as adding course literature on short notice, which was not yet available in audio. And similar to what Katarina was saying, that while disability support is available, the responsibility of obtaining it often falls on the individual student. So for every course they're taking, for every new teacher they meet, they have to approach them and tell them about their needs. And that becomes quite a big burden. And some participants were reluctant to seek support because they didn't want to be bothersome. So they had found something that worked okay for them. And even though they knew that there might be ways of accommodating my needs better, they were reluctant to seek support because they didn't want to bother their teachers. And in general, the international students that I interviewed knew much less about what supports were available compared to the Swedish students. So we can do a lot better job of informing our international students about what support systems are available in the Swedish system, since they have the same right to access them as the Swedish students. And you could see that this norm of real reading is reading by seeing, that had also reached some participants, and they felt that it felt like cheating to read by listening rather than reading by seeing. And especially among the participants who were not formally diagnosed with ADHD, they had feelings of guilt compared to their peers who did not have access to Legemos, and they were asking whether, am I really disabled enough to have this support? So that was another barrier. Okay, and here are a long list of references. If you're interested, we're not going to read them aloud, but if you're interested, you can access them after. I think Maria sent out our slides beforehand. And yeah, if you want to know more about our research, you can find links to our projects here. And you can also read more about the research school. Thank you so much. I will stop sharing now.
That's great. Thank you so much, both of you. That's really, really interesting. We've had a question that's come through in the chat, as well as more of a comment. So I'll read the question out first of all. And for any other attendees, if you'd like to add any further questions into the chat, please do. If you'd rather ask a question verbally, feel free to raise your hand and we'll invite you to speak as well. So the question that's come through already is around, did any participants mention an inability to read with their eyes because of how their brain functions? For example, they don't have like an inside or an internal voice within their brain?
No, I haven't had any participants mentioning that, actually. I think the main focus was, or the main problem for them was maintaining focus. So no, that has not come up in my material. What about you, Katarina?
No, I wouldn't say that. Rather the opposite. Like several of my participants describe how they see pictures in their heads, and that's a really important thing. And in connection to their reading, and some of them like to draw own pictures of their reading. So no, I wouldn't say that. No.
Thank you. I had a question that I'm going to ask whilst I'm waiting for anybody else to share anything. I was wondering around sort of the culture around disclosing disability and neurodivergence in Sweden. Is that something that's very open and seen as sort of like culturally acceptable, or are there sort of like cultural barriers to that disclosure and wanting to sort of have that label, if you will?
I would say that neurodiversity has become much more visible in the Swedish context lately, especially ADHD, and there are a lot of celebrities, for instance, who have disclosed that they have ADHD. So it is becoming less stigmatized, but there's also a huge debate about the large increase in the number of diagnoses, and that, you know, everyone has ADHD these days. And I mean, I feel that sometimes there's a bit of belittling of the problems that people experience. And so, yeah, I would say that it is very visible, but it's not unquestioned.
Yeah, I would say the same thing about dyslexia. There's some voices in the debate saying like, how hard can it be? It's just training that they need to do. They need to train the reading. So it's visible, but there's still a mistrust about it.
I think that overdiagnosis debate is very similar here in the UK at the moment as well. Okay, we've had a question through in the chat around bilingual reading at Swedish universities. So are students expected to read both English and Swedish texts? And then does this become an additional difficulty for neurodivergent students particularly?
Yes, you are expected to, even if you're taking a course where all the teaching is in Swedish, you will be required to read in English. And I mean, some of my participants had said that they hated that was a really big problem for them. Reading in English was and often, sometimes they had heard a word, but they hadn't seen it in print. So that made it more difficult. I think that English has a more, what do you call it, a deeper or like in Swedish, there's less of a difference between the way words are spelled and the way that they're pronounced compared to English. But some of my participants, many of them are in their 20s. They've grown up on the internet in Sweden. Compared to a lot of other European countries, we don't have we often don't dub our TV series or films. So I think that their level of English is pretty high. So it varied. For some, it was a huge problem. For some, they said it makes no difference to me if I'm reading in English or Swedish.
Yeah, so they're used to the pronunciation of the words then because it's not being dubbed.
Yeah, exactly.
I suppose what's just come through in the chat is sort of half a question, half a comment around the fact that there's less research around ADHD in academic practices than other neurodiverse conditions, and sort of wondering why this is. So I don't know if either of you have sort of looked into this at all during your literature review particularly.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it has to do partly with what we consider to be a reading difficulties or a reading disability, because historically, if you look at when they started. I mean, Sweden is a bit different from many other countries in that it's state agencies that have taken a very large role in developing accessible reading materials. And if you look at their, what do you call it, the various investigations and the legal documents preceding the Agency for Accessible Media taking form, they began with only talking about visual impairments, and then in like the 60s or no 70s 80s they started mentioning dyslexia, and I think it's only very recently that ADHD and neuro or autism has been that we've started seeing that as that's also something that might create difficulties in reading, and that it's often since they're not many of my participants, some of them have dyslexia as well. Of course, it's quite common to have multiple conditions, but I think that it's, since most of them can read if they find it, if it's find it engaging, if it's interesting, then it's like, yeah, but you can read, you can decode the text, so what's the problem? So I think that's, yeah, there's only very recently been an opening up to what is a reading disability and what does that entail.
And what have you found so far in your literature review, Katarina, in terms of the split of sort of literature out there and things like that?
You mean on the dyslexia among children?
Yeah.
Or
yeah, was it very sort of child focused or adult focused? I was wondering whether it's, you know, the split there.
Yeah, it's more of the adult focus and focus on assistive technology, not the descriptions on how they do or how they read or what they prefer, like formats or reading by listening and stuff like that. But I haven't done all of my literature review yet, so I have a bit of reading to do. So.
Brilliant. And then there's a question come through more about sort of the practices in Sweden around sort of how early children are screened for dyslexia and whether that is sort of routine. And I guess to sort of build on that, what Karin was saying around sort of multiple diagnoses and conditions, is that sort of like screened at the same time or that kind of thing?
No, not necessarily. No. Most of the screening are done from that the kids are like 10 years old and older, not before that, because then you say that it depends on how much you trained your reading and maybe the language you speak and stuff like that. So it can be quite late in the school life of the children and adolescents when they are screened, and sometimes they have to fight for screening, and because in the Swedish School Act you don't have to have a diagnosis to get the support and guidance, but at the same time it's easier to actually state that you have the right to it if you have the diagnosis. So it's not that easy to get it, but yeah.
Right, thank you. And then we've got a question that I think is applicable to both of you around whether students are saying that the particular voice, so things like the quality or the accent, etc., makes a difference to how it helps them engage or focus. I think you picked up on this slightly with some of your technical barriers there, Karin.
Yeah, I would say so. Sadly, I've mostly heard about problems. So monotonous voices, incorrect pronunciations. Someone mentioned, that was actually a human narrator, but that he was sort of doing this sound a lot, which was very distracting to her. But I think some voices are, I mean, many of them talk about that it's very important to be able to speed up. So if someone's talking too slowly, then that they can adjust the speed. But funnily enough, I think one person talked about how they really enjoyed one book that was read by a person who spoke with a northern Swedish accent, where they often speak a little bit slower than what we do further south. So, but it seems that if it is an engaging voice, and if they like the accent, for instance, then that helps definitely.
That's very useful. And did you find anything similar?
Yeah, I would agree with what Karin said. And my participants mainly talk about that they don't like the AI voices. So they prefer to read by themselves with the eyes instead of reading by listening if there's AI voices. Like ILT education often have these AI voices. So some of the participants doesn't use it because they don't want to listen to it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think most of the systems will be moving to using those types of voices now that the technology is available, won't they? Right, lots of comments saying thank you, and that's been very interesting. And then some context there from somebody else around the statistics around diagnosis. That's brilliant. So just to finish up, I just want to give a massive thank you to you both for coming along and speaking at an NLISN event. I will send everyone a message with a link to an evaluation form. So we'd really appreciate it if you can give us some feedback on that, both for NLISN and our speakers today. Our next NLISN event will be taking place in January, so I'll just post a link to that in the chat. So if anyone is interested in attending, you've got the link there. I will be sending it out on our usual mailing list, but just in case there's anyone here who's not on the NLISN mailing list and won't get it that way, so you've got a link in the chat there if you would like to attend our next event in January. So again, thank you very much for attending, everyone. It's been really interesting. I hope you've enjoyed this morning.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.